up the second in a series, what will be a 4-part series, exploring different crash scenarios involving bicyclists, pedestrians, and drivers. Today's episode will dig into a common type of crash known as the multiple threat crash. We're going to dig into this crash scenario, talk about what we know about it, and how we can use different strategies to prevent it from happening. Maybe you joined us on Monday where we talked about the motorist overtaking bicyclist crash. I hope so, and we're glad to have you back. This is going to take a slightly different angle, focusing on more of a pedestrian safety problem today. My name is Dan Jeline, and I will be facilitating the session today. Joining us today to shed light on this topic are Libby Thomas, Mike Seinecke, Charlie Zagier, and George Branyan. Libby Thomas is a senior research associate at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, where her primary focus areas include bicycle and pedestrian safety and crash causes. She's conducted pedestrian and bicyclist safety and access research and worked with agency representatives and project staff to develop evidence-based case studies, published guides, and interactive tools and resources to help states and communities make safety improvements. Mike Seinecke is a project manager with Lee Engineering in Phoenix, Arizona. Mike has over 38 years of experience in traffic operations and safety, including 26 years with the Phoenix Street Transportation Department. Mike is the former chair of the TRB, the Transportation Research Board Pedestrian Committee, and continues to serve as an emeritus member of that committee. He also serves as an instructor for the Federal Highway Administration's Designing for Pedestrian Safety workshops, as well as the Designing for Bicyclist Safety workshops. Charlie Zagier is also with us today. Charlie is a senior technical advisor at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. Charlie spent more than 40 years studying road safety and evaluating countermeasures, focusing much of his work on improving pedestrian safety. He most recently led a research team that developed crash modification factors for treatments at uncontrolled pedestrian crossings, and is involved with the team now to look at guidance and develop guidance for promoting countermeasures at uncontrolled pedestrian crossings. George Branyan is also with us today. George has served as the Pedestrian Program Coordinator at the District of Columbia's Department of Transportation, or DDOT, since 2005. He works on a variety of engineering, education, and enforcement and development review programs within DDOT's Planning and Sustainability Division. Mr. Branyan oversaw the development of DC's first pedestrian master plan in 2008, and he advocates for pedestrian or innovative practices to improve pedestrian safety and access in Washington, D.C. We are really grateful to have all of our panelists here with us today and to have all of you joining us today. And I want to take a moment to do a little bit of housekeeping to tell you all, as the attendees today, remind you that though you won't have the ability to speak on today's webinar, you can communicate with us by sending us questions and comments throughout. You have a questions box in your control panel. Please continue to use that and tell us what you think about the webinar, send in any questions, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar when we've held about 20 to 25 minutes or so for a discussion period. We are archiving this webinar, and we'll have the presentation slides posted on our archive page. In a moment, I'm going to send that link out to the whole audience so you can see those and maybe follow along with us at home. We are going to be recording the webinar today, and we'll post the recording on that same page probably later today, or if not, by tomorrow morning. You're going to get an email later today that will have a few pieces of information along with it. One will be the link to the archive page. Another will be a link to a certificate of attendance. So as the host maybe of your small group who's attending, you'll be able to go to that link, put in your name, and generate that certificate of attendance. It's important that you also pass it on to the other people who are joining with you so that they can also generate that certificate of attendance. You can follow along with PBIC and track our webinars, our social media. We'll be talking about this webinar today using hashtag PBIC webinar. We're active there. We also have a newsletter. These are all really good ways to stay up to date with us and make sure that you know when we have webinars happening. Again, like I said, we have a 4-part series that we're doing now. So we're doing the second part today. We'll have 2 more webinars focusing on crash problems coming up in the next couple of months. So be sure to check out our websites and sign up for our newsletter to track those. I want to mention that for those of you out there who claim American Planning Association credits, CM credits, we have gotten this webinar approved for those credits. So please check their event calendar for more information about that. And so anything else you want to know about PBIC webinars, you can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars to learn more about that. I want to take a brief poll of the audience before we move too much further. Take a look at your screen if you don't mind. We're interested in finding out about how many people are out there today. So I'm going to leave this open for just a moment. We don't want to take up too much time with it, but let us know if it's just you, if you have a small group with you, maybe a larger group, 6 to 7 or 8 or more. Let us know about that, and then we'll move right into our presentations today. All right, thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We appreciate your response. We're going to move right along with our presentations today. And as you may know, PBIC just released a series of animations to make it easier for law enforcement, driver education instructors, advocates, and transportation professionals to engage with others in dialogue about common crash types that may occur between drivers, pedestrians, and bicyclists. The videos that are available at pedbicinfo.org/crash-videos focus on behaviors by road users that can help prevent these crashes. The same webpage also includes suggestions for how different professionals and advocates can use these animations. We really would like to encourage you to visit that website, check out all the animations, and consider engaging with these groups, some of the ones maybe you don't work with all the time, about these crash problems and talk about them and maybe think through solutions. You might share some of the things you learned on today's webinar with those individuals. The animations focus on changes to driver and pedestrian behavior specifically to address these crash problems. Our webinar time today is really going to focus more on countermeasure strategies that can help prevent these multiple threat crashes. So we're going to focus a lot on design and engineering, but we are going to touch on some of those other measures, education and enforcement, a few of these other things. But we know that design has a big influence over behavior, so we want to be sure that we discuss this crash type with consideration to all the different ways we can prevent it through roadway design strategies. I'll show you a couple of clips here from our animations, really that break down, in this case, the multiple threat crash, which typically occurs when a near-side vehicle at an uncontrolled crossing location stops or yields to a pedestrian crossing at that location, while the vehicle approaching in the other lane either doesn't yield or doesn't see the pedestrian trying to cross. We've got a few different vantage points in our animations. The pedestrian, as you can see, may not, when that vehicle is stopped or yielded, may not see that other approaching vehicle. And when the pedestrian's coming out, that stopped vehicle may hide the pedestrian until the last second, setting up a quite severe crash that we call the multiple threat crash. Mike Sinecki and Libby Thomas will go into a little bit more detail about this crash type during their presentations. But we really see these animations as a way to break down the crash problem. They do flow as videos, so you can kind of watch it through from a number of vantage points and look in on some of those recommendations for behavior change and other things that you can do to prevent the crash. Again, we'll hope you'll consider the different ways you can use the animations to start conversations with your colleagues and community members. We want you to watch that animation after the webinar, but right now what I'd like to do is turn things over to Libby Thomas, who's going to kind of start out by sharing what we know about this crash problem from crash data, the data that we have access to. So Libby, whenever you're ready, I think we're ready to dive right in.
All right. Will you advance for me, Dan? Okay. All right, so as Dan mentioned, we are taking a look today at some data sources we have to try to explore what we know about this crash type and related crash types. But first I thought I would just get you up to speed on fatalities in the U.S. in general, which we know have been rising pretty dramatically over the last 10 years or so, while other crashes have been stabilizing. So U.S. pedestrian fatalities have increased just since 2014 by 13%. So the urban and rural crashes both continue to go up, and rural crashes seem to have increased more, but because of the larger overall numbers, we see still that urban areas account for the largest percentage of total fatalities, around 3/4 of total pedestrian fatalities. So this data element, urban-rural, is defined in, these data are from FARS, which is a national census of all traffic-related fatalities in the U.S. or fatal crashes. And so we obtain these data from the FARS system. This is maintained by NHTSA. To do these analyses, and since 2014, but first, well, before I get into that, let me just show you a little bit more about the data. So as I mentioned, it's a census of all fatal crashes. For pedestrians and bikes, Typically, they are at least one of the people killed in crashes that they're involved in with motor vehicles, so most often they're the most severely injured person. But you see other data in this table. There are other people sometimes involved, multiple people involved in fatal crashes, or more than one pedestrian or bicyclist. So this is the combined data. I thought it just might be of interest to the audience to see all the person types. Typically, when NHTSA reports on pedestrian fatalities, they include only those rows that say pedestrian. But in these analyses today, we've included the persons on personal conveyances, which, as best I've been able to determine, includes people in wheelchairs and assisted devices, and may include skateboards and other such devices like that aren't included in pedal cyclists or anywhere else as vehicle occupants. So those are the data that we'll be working with the rest of the day, the ones that are highlighted in yellow. Okay, so this chart shows just a breakdown again of those fatalities by rural and urban locations, and then by whether these collisions were indicated to have occurred at an intersection or not. So you've just seen the rural and urban indicators, which the definition changed a little bit from 2014 to 2015, but basically now NHTSA is using the definition accepted by Federal Highway Administration as a census of urbanized areas. The intersection-related variable comes from coding, which is now being performed by FARS analysts to type the pedestrian and bicycle crashes. So one of the questions asked in that process, and when I say type crashes, they're using a methodology that comes from, it's derived originally from NHTSA methodologies developed in the 1970s through 1990s, and then kind of encoded into PBIC, crash typing software. And so they've been using this methodology, although not the software, to code all pedestrian and bicycle crashes from 2014. So that's why we're using this 3-year period of data for this analysis. So basically you can see that urban non-intersection locations account for nearly 50% of all pedestrian crashes, while non-intersection locations in rural areas account for another 20%. Intersections in urban areas also account for a substantial number, nearly 24%. Okay. All right, so just looking at broadly, to break this down a little bit more, and as Dan mentioned, we're trying to get a handle on what's going on. So I've broken down the crash types that they did. Actually, I've kind of recompiled them again into these broad groups of pedestrian crash types. So all the types that involve pedestrians crossing a street, whether it involves a turning motorist or a straight-through motorist, are in that top row. Those are combined pedestrian crossing crash types. So you can see there that the urban locales account for an even higher percentage, 82% of all of those types of crashes. The parallel path types, on the other hand, they're a little bit more highly represented. About 38% occur in rural areas. So you see some variation, and that's to be expected because pedestrians walking along roads don't typically they may not have a facility, a separated sidewalk or path to walk on. Then there's some other types, crossing expressways, which aren't included above. There are a number of circumstances, especially in pedestrian fatalities, where it's just unknown where the pedestrian, what happened prior to the crash. And we also have a sizable number of hit and run motor vehicles related to pedestrian fatalities. So a lot of those are found there. And then there's a number of just other odd types, which include a mix of things involving people standing near disabled vehicles, work zone related crash types, vehicles hitting other vehicles before they hit the pedestrian, loss of control types, just a variety of things in that category, but combined it accounts for about 1/4 of all the pedestrian crashes. So just to show a few of the scenarios we're thinking about today, Dan also already showed you some images from the videos, and this is the top image here is kind of an image that represents multiple threat crash in the PBIC software. So it demonstrates that maybe traffic is slowing for a signal ahead, or for whatever reason, a first vehicle in the first lane, it may be at a crosswalk, as Dan showed you before, a mid-block but uncontrolled crosswalk. So the first vehicle slows, the pedestrian thinks, okay, they're waving me on, it's safe to cross, but then there's a vehicle coming along in the second lane that strikes the pedestrian. A similar scenario is the pedestrian trapped situation, and that typically happens at a signal where the pedestrian is maybe caught still in the intersection. The signal changes for green in the conflicting direction of traffic. Maybe people don't realize, the drivers don't realize there's someone still in the intersection, and they may be struck by a vehicle either approaching in the same lane or in the opposite direction. So that's kind of a similar scenario. For both of these, especially multiple threat, it's really unclear how often this scenario can be detected by the officers who are reporting on crashes, if there are no witnesses to what happened. Maybe it's at night, these hit and run situations. You know, it's just unclear if this is being captured well in the data. So other similar types with similar risks, that especially at multi-lane crossings, are dart outs, which can be also from behind a parked car or other objects. So that's very similar to a multi-threat situation, and that could also occur at a mid-block location, a mid-block crossing, especially if parking hasn't been pulled back from that location. Others are pedestrian dash, which implies that the pedestrian suddenly ran into the street. Motorists failed to yield, pedestrian failed to yield types. Basically, these are crossing path types of conflicts, even if we don't know who yielded right away or who didn't yield in all circumstances. Bus related, a bus could set up a multiple threat situation if you have transit stops in a segment without, and the view is blocked by the bus. So basically, it's really rather difficult to know whether crash reporters are noting this situation where other vehicles may have blocked the view of the pedestrian for the striking vehicle driver. So again, here's kind of a summary of the data from the U.S. fatality data that we've been looking at. So for all of those crossing types of crashes and all U.S. fatalities in general, we identified only 57% that the coders could clearly identify as a multiple threat type of crash, only 14 for the trap type of situation. In North Carolina data, this is for 5 years of data, and this is for all severity of crashes. I'm not sure what the T stands for. I think that was meant to be total. But so 91 multiple threat crashes were identified for the entire state over a period of 5 years, and this is for all severity, and 35 of trap types. So you can see it looks like a small percentage of the problem, but again, we don't know if that's actually a low percentage or a problem with the reporting. So with those caveats, the next table will show you some of the factors that we did look at in relation to multi-thread and other types. Okay, so basically we took all of the crashes for the multiple threat and the other crash types and looked at the relationship to a number of other factors. Now, I should say that the intersection ones, as I mentioned, are coded from the PBIC coders, and they determine that information from all the information available on the crash report, the image, the narrative, and so forth, as well as what the police officers said about the crash. Some of the variables like the traffic control and the roadway characteristics are reported on the crash report as well. Those are not verified by anyone, so we know there can be some issues with the reliability of those types of data, especially we found with the number of lanes. So unfortunately, some agencies report number of lanes by direction for divided, undivided roads. It's inconsistent across reporting we have found when we've looked at that. So I wish we could explore that in more depth today, but unfortunately we just don't feel we can rely on the number of lanes data that come along with crash reporting. We really need to look at the number of lanes from roadway data by matching these two types of data together. So again, there are the numbers, a multiple threat, 57 in total, but we did see a few situations where it seems overrepresented compared to other crossing types, and that is a fairly high percentage occurred on median divided roads, of whether it was a painted median or a raised median or a raised protected median. And that was the case for the tracked type as well. We saw high percentages occurring in 30 to 35 per hour speed limit roads and higher speed limit roads as well, but the 30 and 35 were overrepresented compared to other types, and we think that's because this type is really associated more with urban types of locations. So there are just some other relationships, some of the other similar crash types that we mentioned and their associations that are, and how those are related to different roadway factors. One of the other issues we took a look at, the coders have been coding kind of a more detailed scenario on which leg of an intersection crashes occurred on. Was it from the motorist perspective? Was it the near leg, the first leg they crossed, or the far leg as they went through the intersection? So we saw that multiple threat was a little more highly represented on the near leg, whereas tracked was more highly represented on the far leg. They were more likely to be struck in the far crosswalk as the motorist went through an intersection. So that's all. So just in summary, multiple threat and tracked crash types appear to be a low percentage of both fatalities and total crashes, although we know that North Carolina may not be representative of all states. It does have urban and rural areas that we looked at there. So it isn't known whether reporting issues affect the numbers. Most multiple threat fatalities occur, though, at non-intersection locations. A lack of traffic control, I should have highlighted this in the table before, but that is overrepresented in multiple threat fatalities, even more so than for all crossing type of crashes. The median divided roads also seem overrepresented, as we mentioned. And again, better data on numbers of lanes and environmental circumstances might help us to better define this type of crash. We didn't detect, although we know that light conditions, darkness or non-daylight conditions are really highly represented for pedestrian fatalities. This crash type in particular didn't seem to be overrepresented for nighttime crashes. So it may be that it is more of a situation where it occurs, and this is speculation, but it may occur more during congested hours, which tend to be more daylight conditions, because slowing traffic may be more inclined to stop and wait if they're waiting maybe to get to an intersection and make a right turn and such. But then the other lane is free flowing.
Right.
So it can be a dangerous situation. It's just not we're not sure how well we're capturing it in the data.
Well, and I think that's an important point to make. And even if the numbers appear low, what we do know about this crash is if it does happen at that higher speed, it can be quite severe, result in a fatality. So it's still worth talking about, even if in comparison to our crash type on Monday with the motor vehicle overtaking a bicyclist, we can kind of clearly see some big chunks of that crash in the total. Not so much here, but doesn't mean that we not need to be concerned about this problem, because it can be quite severe in terms of the outcome. So I appreciate that, kind of breaking down the data, Libby. It gives us a good place to start out with. A couple of questions that came in that you can respond to now. It's a good time for it since we're on data. Was there any ability to look at these numbers by sort of functional classification of the roadway to know maybe what types of roads these are where these are occurring?
Yes, functional classification is there. However, I guess I'm not sure what that means as far as the roadway geometry and risk. I mean, it's certainly, we could take a look at that though, and those variables are available. The other thing I meant to point out though is that the way the data are linked in FARs, they only attach a roadway to the motor vehicles. That means when the pedestrians and bikes are on different roads, we don't know what their roadway is, but given that they are crossing the roads that the motor vehicle is on in this scenario, that's what we were taking a look at, was the motorist facing traffic control, for example, and in, what was it, 82% of the cases, they had no control. Sure. So yeah, it's kind of, just be aware what you're looking at is that it's the motor vehicle road, not the pedestrian and bicycle road. Maybe that can be added in later years.
I think the point overall that the ability to have a coder or maybe in the reporting in some capacity that this crash type may be missed in some cases, and that may be a reason why we don't see more of them in reporting. So like you said, is it a problem with the reporting or are they just really low numbers? I think that we can clearly see some of the factors that may contribute to this crash based on what you just shared with us, and then I think what Mike Seinecke will be talking through in a bit. So let's move into Mike's presentation, and then what we're going to do is come back at the end, maybe some more questions, and we'll explore this data issue a little further. Mike, I'm going to be starting with your slides here, and please take it right over, and Mike, I'll just advance for you.
Okay, yeah, my name is Mike Seinecke, as Dan had said earlier, and I had, with my 26 years with the City of Phoenix, the multiple threat crash was one of the most challenging to address, and it also involved some of the more severe crashes. Why don't you go to the next slide? One of the reasons why you'll have multiple threat crashes occur is on streets. People like to live on low volume streets. They like to have very little traffic on the streets. But if you have a large community, you've got to find ways to move traffic around. And so since most of the other streets are very minor, discontinuous, you will have these big major streets that are multi-lane and that where a lot of the traffic has to move on. And that's where our crashes are occurring. And I think I agree with what Dan had said earlier. Is a lot of the crashes, the multiple threat nature of the crash is not getting captured, it's not getting recorded, or it's not being computerized. And you have to read the report to be able to understand how the crash is happening, or you have to look at some of the details. And in some cases, the details are not provided, so you can really tell what's happening on this. But I'm going to be speaking about 5 factors that are associated with multiple threat crashes. One is the driver and pedestrian visibility. The second one is speed. Third is lane configuration, and the number of lanes is very important, associated with traffic volume, which is the opportunity for a multiple threat crash. And then talk about how lighting may impact that. Go ahead, Dan, next slide. The multiple threat crash problem occurs, as this slide shows, when a vehicle stops at a crosswalk and it creates a visual screen for the car in the adjacent lane. Now, it doesn't have to be the curb lane. The pedestrian could be crossing the other direction. But in many cases, the driver of the vehicle that's approaching from behind doesn't understand why the motorist is stopping and will pass that motorist, even though we'll be speaking in a few minutes, it's against the law to do so. It could be a motorist that's either in an adjacent lane or a motorist that's behind the stopping motorist that is going to go around them. They have no idea what's there. The pedestrian similarly could have a visual screen. However, we have always tried to tell pedestrians that they have a blocker. So crossing one lane at a time is a way for them to overcome the situation. But many times, psychologically, when they see one vehicle stop, they feel everyone is stopping. And in many cases, drivers out there, they have a lot of distractions. It's not good. Drivers are talking on cell phones. They're talking to each other in the vehicles. They're looking at maps, trying to find their way around. They don't have their mind on what's going on. Go to the next slide. This basically shows an excerpt from the Uniform Vehicle Code 11-502, which says, whenever any vehicle is stopped at a marked crosswalk or at any unmarked crosswalk at an intersection to permit a pedestrian to cross the roadway, the driver of any other vehicle approaching from the rear shall not overtake and pass such stopped vehicle. Now, everywhere I've gone, the state laws have that provision in there on talking about right-of-way at crosswalks. It may use slightly different wordings, but virtually every state that I know of that I've looked at has that wording that prohibits a motorist in a moving vehicle to pass a vehicle stopped at a stopped crosswalk. Now, some of the problem is that people don't know this. People are not cognizant of this. They have no idea in some cases why people are stopping. Now, notice it's also a marked or an unmarked crosswalk at an intersection. Some people don't know what an unmarked crosswalk is. There are a lot of people out there. There are people, we've even had a judge who improperly ruled on what an unmarked crosswalk was at a T intersection. He didn't believe there were any intersections across the street when there indeed are, and that would be, it's a problem. So we have a problem in the education. And people who, when they are smartest about what the laws are is when they get their driver's license. Now that's 40-some years ago for me. So, you know, you don't have any refresher courses if you're not involved in traffic safety. Go ahead for the next one. Go ahead to the next slide. There you go. So what are some of the problems of multiple threat? Not only could be from a stopped vehicle, it could be from a parked vehicle. In this case, the pedestrian standing at the curb would not have a good view of oncoming traffic, and some of the solutions can be, go ahead, hit the next forward. It could be putting in curb bulb outs so that the pedestrian is standing in a secure spot where they can see beyond that parked traffic. So the multiple threat can be what traffic stopped in the street or traffic parked along the roadway. And we have to look for those locations where pedestrians are going to be crossing to make sure they have good locations where they can see oncoming traffic and traffic has a better opportunity to see them. Go to the next slide. In some cases, the visibility, they refer to that as, you know, providing daylighting or open visibility. Now, one thing I want to point out in this slide is that a bike lane could provide a lot of benefits, not only for providing space for the bicyclists, but it also provides that separation that can help promote better visibility for drivers and pedestrians waiting to cross. And also note that the visibility problem can be from a median island. If you're planting big trees along the side of the street or in the median, we actually had a case years ago involving a skateboarder going through a median, and there was a big ocotillo there, a big plant that during certain times of the year, it all leaves out and you cannot see beyond it. And they basically, our solution at that location was to relocate that ocotillo into a spot where it wasn't going to create a visibility obstruction. So plants along the roadway that are intended to do good, as well as parking, can create this problem where you don't have the daylighting, where you don't have the clear view between the approaching driver and a pedestrian waiting to cross. And it's not just at crosswalks, it could be anywhere along the street. Go on to the next slide. Visibility obstructions also concur with larger vehicles, trucks or buses along the road. Again, the pedestrian has a great blocker there that they can cross one lane at a time, but it creates a really difficult visual screen for the motorist approaching in the other moving lane. Go to the next slide. Here's a case where here's a case where you can look at it from the pedestrian's perspective. Once again, the pedestrian cannot see beyond the bus. Buses really shouldn't be stopping on the approach to uncontrolled crosswalks. They should be far side, but there may be some reasons why you can't, because of ADA access or because the bus is turning the corner there. But in most cases, the buses create such a visual screen that they should be put on the far side of the intersections and not create the condition that comes here. And once again, there's that psychological condition where the pedestrian presumes that all the other motorists see them, will stop for them, and that typically doesn't happen. Another case happens with a bus passenger wants to catch a connecting bus or is in a hurry. They may jump off the bus and quickly go in front of in the street in front of the bus, where you don't have a chance for the driver to see them. Go on to the next slide. Another issue is where our multiple threaded crashes occur are typically on our higher speed streets. We have a lot of 40, 45 mile an hour streets within the city limits, and that is conditions that are more ripe for higher impact speeds and the higher chances for people, or higher difficulty to avoid a crash. When we talk about speed, we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. First of all, it's the ability for the drivers and the pedestrians to see each other, the ability for the driver to react and avoid a crash, and then of course speed has a major impact on crash severity. Go on to the next slide. When you're at very slow speeds, you can see more of your surroundings. You can see what's along the roadway with the pedestrians that may be crossing from right to left. But in this case, if you can envision it at 15 mile an hour, now you're going to a higher speed. You're looking further and further down the street. Go to the next one. As the speed increases to 25, you're even looking further, and of course 30 miles. And imagine on streets that are going 35 or 40 miles an hour. You're not seeing the periphery. You're looking for, because you have to react. It takes a much longer distance to react to conditions down the street. You're looking further down the street, and you're not basically looking at what's along the side of the street. So the vision, the cone vision for a driver and the ability where they're expecting issues to occur is further on down the road and not to the right and left as they cross. And go to the next slide. This is a chart that we use in the Designing for Pedestrian Safety courses, talking about how speed affects crash avoidance and how your ability to stop. When you're going 40 miles an hour, the distance that it takes to perceive, react, put the brake on, and bring your vehicle to a stop is almost a city block. So that takes a long time, and we have our greatest difficulty for warning of drivers for crash avoidance on our higher speed streets, because it takes so much distance for a driver to bring that vehicle to stop. And even a 20 mile an hour street, you're looking at 100 foot to be able to react and to bring your vehicle to a stop and avoid a crash. So that is one major issue. Go to the next slide. The other major issue is what happens when you have an impact at various speeds. And this slide actually indicates the impact speed and the chance for a fatality. Now, this is for an average pedestrian. If you have an elderly pedestrian, the chance for a fatality is far greater than this. And what this table that doesn't show, or this figure doesn't show, is those that may survive the crash may have long-lasting and severe injuries for the rest of their lives out of this. So one of the ways that we can address and minimize the chance for a fatality or a severe injury is to get vehicles to go slower and slower. Much easier said than done. Go to the next slide, please. And we have long crossing distances. You can see that some of the challenges it creates, especially for younger pedestrians or for elderly pedestrians. You have a longer exposure to traffic. You're going to have greater conflicts. You're going to have greater vehicle delay, and that's because at your traffic signals, when you have your big wide intersections, people are always trying to put dual left turns in or right turn lanes. In addition to this, you can get really big intersections, and many times the deciding factor of your clearances is what your signal timing is at this intersection. It's based on pedestrian clearances. So you have a big intersection, you're going to have longer cycle lengths, and that means greater vehicle delay at the intersection. And of course, you have slower pedestrians, they're going to have much more time to cross the street. Go to the next slide. And again, if you take a look at streets like these, when you add traffic volume, you add your opportunity for crashes. Now, I can remember when Charlie did his big study on marked and unmarked crosswalks. He called me, and I won't mention the agency I used to work for, but he said, you had the highest at this particular location, had the highest number of crashes. That location had 4 lanes in one direction, 3 in the other, and a center two-way left turn lane, 84 foot from curb face to curb face, and a marked crosswalk. Now, on one side of the street, we had an apartment complex. The other side of the street, we had a daycare center and a grocery store. Now, since we've gone back, we've reduced a lane. We've done some other crossing treatments to make it much easier to cross. But that was one of those types of conditions that really shouldn't ask. You don't expect to put a marked crosswalk and expect that to resolve your pedestrian safety issues. So the wider streets like this and the more traffic you add to it is going to have your more opportunity. The other thing I want to mention too is when you talked about traffic congestion, drivers who are frustrated because they're caught in congestion, or they may have been caught at 3 cycles at the last signal, they're less apt and likely to stop. So the more congestion you create, the less likely they are going to be able to want to stop mid-block or at other locations along the route. Go ahead to the next slide. Another factor is illumination for nighttime crossings. When you put crossings and designate your crossings, make sure you have lights there, because the lights really help light it up. We've had some situations where the crosswalks were put right in between lights along a continuously lit route. That would be the darkest spot. You want the people to cross at the lightest spot. They have a big crash reduction factor. Now, the crash reduction factor, and these that are listed here, are just for those that are crossing at night. It's not your total crashes, but it's your nighttime crashes, and you'll see a disproportionate amount of pedestrian crashes occur during the nighttime hours. Next slide. I believe this is my last slide. The one other thing about lighting is that putting lighting, the old way of doing it was, this is a mid-block example, is just putting it on one side of the street. The better way to do it is to try to put lights on both sides of the street so you have uniform lighting, and put the light in advance of the crosswalk. It doesn't have to be far in advance, 10, 15 foot in advance of the crosswalk. So as opposed to when you have it above the pedestrian, you have a silhouette effect, versus when you have it in advance of the crosswalk, you're lighting the pedestrian, you can see colors better, and as a result, you can recognize things better. And about 20 lux and or 2 horizontal foot candles at about 5 foot above the pavement is the desirable lighting levels for your crossings. And this is a simple 2-lane crossing. Just imagine for a wider street where you want to get the lights out over the roadway and slightly in advance. And I believe that's all the slides that I have, and we're going to move on to Charlie to talk about some of the solutions for the multi-thread crashes.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. That was an awesome kind of review of all these different factors that could be contributing to this problem. I'm sitting across the table from Charlie Zagier right now, and you mentioned at the outset, you've had some history with Charlie on this topic. Charlie's devoted a lot of his career to understanding and improving safety at uncontrolled crossings. So Charlie and I are going to go back and forth through a few strategies that we see as kind of some of the things that we could be doing better at uncontrolled crossings. We'll finish with some recommendations for, okay, now that we know what these options are, how do you know which ones belong where? So sharing some more recent guidance, and then wrap it up there. Then we'll move it on, and George Brandon will share some perspective from DC. So compared to some of the images that Mike just shared, we've got a pretty nice looking scenario, all things considered, for a multi-lane crossing here compared with some of the others without some of these other treatments. And the question is, maybe think about, what does this crossing have that some of those other locations didn't have? And you can identify a few things. You can see efforts made to not only put the pedestrian out closer in a better visible position, shorten that crossing, things like these bulb outs. There are things like medians and protected refuge areas for helping break up some of these longer crossings. These advanced lines, stop lines, yield lines, to get drivers to stop further back from the crosswalk, as well as any additional lighting signals, beacons, things that you can do to really reinforce yielding behavior. We're going to talk about all of these today in a couple of different categories. Some of them intended to really address some of these visibility, conspicuity issues that Mike raised, others to really reinforce safety by improving yielding rates at crosswalks.
Yeah, so we're going to try to accomplish several objectives to get at some of the causes of the crashes. In fact, one of the things when you often look at pedestrian crash reports, it's not uncommon to see that the driver involved in the crash, when asked about, why did you hit the pedestrian, will say, well, the pedestrian came out of nowhere. And so oftentimes, when you have a driver making a statement like that, it's just that the driver didn't see the pedestrian until the last minute. So that might be a hint or a clue that might have been a multiple threat crash.
Great point. Great point. There's this package of crosswalk visibility enhancements, Charlie, that that you promote. This is from the STEP, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian Guide, which we'll get into in just a minute. But some of the things that are packaged here in these visibility enhancements or things we'll talk about next, one of those being this curb extension or bulb out. Mike Zanecki shared this slide, but what you're doing here, like we said, is really putting that pedestrian in a more visible position, opening up those sight lines so that the pedestrian can see oncoming traffic can see the pedestrian. Yeah,
and also having a curb extension or bulb out can reduce the speed of the right turning vehicle. So if a pedestrian is crossing, from the bottom to the top of the screen here, that green vehicle making a right turn will more than likely, make it at a much slower speed and increase the pedestrian chance of being seen and not struck.
Absolutely, and I think in locations, this is really more realistic when you've got that on-street parking. Obviously, you can't extend these into a full lane, but it reminds us that on-street parking can contribute to the multiple threat cache. It's not just a vehicle that stops or yields. It could be any obstruction there. So putting those pedestrians into a more visible place. I think dwelling on the advanced stop and yield lines as a countermeasure is really important because, as I think we'll see, depending the money that you're investing in this treatment for the benefit you get is pretty substantial. So we can explore kind of what that does. And Charlie, maybe talk us through this slide showing on the left the advanced without the advanced stop, and then on the right with.
Yeah, and you can see we actually seeing data that shows that where you do have the advanced stop or yield lines with signing to say stop here for pedestrian or yield here to pedestrian, depending on what the laws in your state how they're quoted. But if vehicle A will stop at the stop bar, then the pedestrian will have a much better view of vehicle B, and the driver of vehicle B will be much more likely to see the pedestrian. So there's time for the driver to stop or the pedestrian to see the vehicle speeding through and maybe just delaying finishing the crossing.
Yeah, and I think that there's guidance available out there for depending on the speed, depending on the lane configuration, how far back from the crosswalk you should place these, and the difference is some states are stop states and some are yield states, and that'll depend on the marking and the signage that goes along with it. But bottom line is, by pulling people far enough back from the crossing, it'll open up that visibility a little bit more.
And for the higher speed approaches in particular, you may want to tend more to place the stop line or yield line more like 50 feet, and as speeds get lower, maybe you can inch closer to the 20-foot distance. So that's sort of a factor, and also the number of lanes. So you want to sort of not only really consider this advanced stop or yield marking with all of your established marked crosswalks, but then go out and observe. After you've installed a designated crossing with some of these supplemental treatments, make sure that you're observing what's going on and make sure that it is functioning properly.
Right. And the thing that jumps out to me is the 25% reduction based on research in pedestrian crashes that can occur after these go in without, and that's even without another accompanying treatment. Obviously more successful if there's something else done as well, but that's a pretty good reduction.
Yeah, and for a fairly low cost.
Right, exactly.
Compared to something like the RFB or the pedestrian hybrid beacon.
Right. Lighting, Mike mentioned this. We won't go into too much detail, but it's important. I think some of the things that I think about when it comes to lighting are, if we're talking about multi-lane corridors, great distances from one side of the street to the other, if you've only got, as in many places, lighting on one side of the road, that'll be insufficient for illuminating the entirety of the crosswalk on both sides. And often, I think, thinking through placing the lighting, coordinating with the crosswalk locations, as opposed to just placing them at set intervals, when that coordination isn't done, you're not always going to have lighting where you need it, at the crosswalk locations.
Right, and we realize that agencies, don't have unlimited funds, but certainly, where you're having pedestrian crashes and or complaints that are occurring at night, these are the highest priority crossing locations to consider overhead lighting.
Mike, I might bring you back in right here. We did get a question about lighting that I wonder if you can answer for us, and that's what preference do we have in terms of the type of lighting for using at crosswalks? For example, an LED or some other type. Is there sort of a clear and set guidance on this?
Yeah, the preference is for an LED lighting for one reason, well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you get the whiter light, it's actually a blue light that they refer to, but it looks whiter. You can recognize colors better, and the better you recognize colors, the more you can see what's out there, a pedestrian or anything else. If you have like high pressure sodium along the street, putting your LEDs at your crossing points might be better, but might be one solution. But putting all LEDs primarily because the lighting efficiency and the maintenance efficiency, and I've had people tell me from state DOTs that the real savings is in the maintenance and how you don't have to go out there for a much longer period of time to replace the bulbs. They last that much longer.
Sure. Thanks for that, Mike. We'll move into some other ideas of talking about bus stop placement. Obviously, Mike mentioned that the bus can be the obstacle to being pedestrians seeing that oncoming traffic. One solution is really to have that crosswalk come around behind the bus. That way, if you can design things properly, as in this case here, where pedestrians are getting off and maybe using the crosswalk behind the bus, that's maybe alleviating some of that visibility concern.
Yeah, and in fact, we're going to talk about some of the other different countermeasure options in just a minute. I mean, one of the main ones to keep in mind for every designated pedestrian crossing is to make sure that the advance or the approach to that crosswalk is clear. You don't want to have parked cars. In fact, in Europe, some of the countries over there, they have a special marking that they put on the advance of a crosswalk. That means, you better not stop and park here or you're in major trouble.
Yeah. The refuge island is another treatment. Obviously, you can add some more protection to pedestrians, give them a little bit more visibility, adding a pedestrian refuge island, breaking up that crossing distance, and we're seeing, again, benefit here and reduced crashes, 32% reduction in pedestrian vehicle crashes by putting in a raised median island.
Yeah, and so on multi-lane roads, based on our recent research for NCHRP, I mean, it's pretty clear that on, if you can somehow put in a raised median island, that can be one of the most effective treatments, particularly in combination of things like the advanced stop lines and markings and signing. So that's really a good kind of treatment to use in conjunction with some of these others.
We'll keep moving and offer a couple of ideas on two other systems, the rectangular rapid flashing beacon as well as the pedestrian hybrid beacon. So those are kind of two things that are often talked about in the same conversation. The rectangular rapid flashing beacon is going to be a push button operated system. It's that stutter flash, a set of warning lights that really draw drivers' attention to the fact that a pedestrian is crossing at a location. They're less expensive than that pedestrian hybrid beacon we mentioned, and can still have a pretty good benefit for pedestrians, reducing pedestrian crashes by 47%.
Yeah, and when we did the research a few years ago, many of these RFB installations started in St. Petersburg, Florida, and now they're being used in different cities around the country, not in that great of numbers yet. And you may know that there's been some suspension of the approvals for your RFB from Federal Highway until recently. And now that it's been sort of back on the tentative approval list, you still have to apply for permission to experiment with it. But Federal Highway is granting those applications pretty much, easily. But it is something to keep an eye on because at least we have some evidence that while these may be useful, particularly even on multi-lane roads, there's still some question about whether they're adequate when you get to the really higher speed, higher volume multi-lane roads, and that's where the pedestrian hybrid beacon.
Let's talk about the pedestrian hybrid beacon too. It's a sort of a different sort of system, operates in a similar way. However, you're going to bring through a flashing a wigwag pattern with the light system. It's going to be dark when no one's using it, but then as soon as it's activated, it'll eventually bring drivers to a full stop, adding a little bit more protection on those high-speed, high-volume corridors.
Yeah, and I will say that most of the systems, whether they're RFB or pedestrian hybrid beacon, that are being used in the U.S. now, most, not all, but most of them do have other supplemental treatments used like high visibility crosswalk, advanced stopper yield, markings, and signing. Many of them have raised median islands. And it's that combination of treatments is really, I think, one of the things we want to look at, and also, nighttime lighting. So it really gives the motorists and pedestrians a better chance of doing the right thing.
So the question that a lot of people have typically is well, if you know about the countermeasures, you know about them, you know they exist, you can find a lot of information about them. The question is really, how do you know which one to use and where, and what conditions will lead you to use certain things? This gets into not only the multiple threat crash, but improving safety at all of these uncontrolled crossings. And Charlie, that's where the safe transportation for every pedestrian guidance kind of comes in. That's something you've been working on lately.
Right, and I'll mention this is a project that HSRC worked on. We were a subcontractor to VHB and overall for Federal Highway Administration. And so we just have an update of this guide that is going to be made available here soon. Lauren Blackburn tells me that, any day we might expect that to be available. And Dan, maybe we can send that link out to some of the folks.
Sure.
But essentially, what the intent of the countermeasure selection part of this is many of you may be familiar with the study we did in 2005. And it basically looked at the safety effects of marked versus unmarked crosswalks. And the bottom line there, you may remember, is there are many situations, particularly the multi-lane, higher volume, more than about 12 or 15,000 vehicles a day, more than 3 or 4 lanes. That combination, you need to be careful to not just use paint alone. These are the situations where you need to use something more substantial. So if you're going to designate a pedestrian crossing, here you need to really look at some of these other potential treatment combinations to make sure that you're not making things worse. You're going to do no harm. And so this is where the 2018 step guide comes in. And it really does take into account looking at different combinations of different crosswalk visibility enhancements, raised crossings, pedestrian refuge islands, pedestrian hybrid beacons, road diets, going generally from 4 lanes to 3, sometimes 5 lanes to 3. And also now that we have recent permission from Federal Highway to also be considering the RFB now, we have this package of treatment possibilities. And so we sort of put them all together in what we call Table 1. And basically, first, let me just give you a quick overview of the step guide. It really, comes through with a 6-step process about how you should go about collecting your system-wide data and identifying crossings that need to be considered for treatment. And so how you go about the process of selecting the right treatments and then following up, et cetera, et cetera. But this resource has several different components. It has a fact sheet, a detailed sheet on each of the countermeasures. It has what we call the tech sheets that gives a lot of the technical information, kind of a guidebook on how you go about improving uncontrolled crossings. And then there's different things like the pocket version, and we have the graphics to go along with it. Next slide. And I will say that coming up with the countermeasure options and the solutions wasn't just something that we sat around the table in a smoke-filled room. This was really based on not only the MUTCD, and we looked at local and state guidelines from around the country, especially for some of the agencies that really were doing more for pedestrian safety. We looked at the STEP guide, and we looked at NCHRP and FHWA research studies. Libby Thomas did a really good synthesis of current practice, not only of the research that's been done on different crossing treatments, but what agencies. I think you got 40 different states and a couple dozen local agencies, and really, got input from them on how they were making choices on pedestrian treatments and what they were using in different situations. So what we're going to do is just to mention one of the steps of the 6-step process, and we're going to focus on what are the decision points. Now there is a field guide that goes along with this that really helps you go through a step-by-step process, and we're not going to get into that now, but we'll ask you to go to the website, I guess the Federal Highway website, click on it, and you can see all these resources. So here is the Table 1 that sort of takes over where the 2005 research study left off. And so the question is, if you're going to designate a pedestrian crossing, now we realize that on many of your low-speed local streets, low-volume, 2-lane roads, you really don't need necessarily any treatment. You don't need to mark a crossing at every single intersection in your city. Many of them have had no crashes in years, and they seem to be operating safely. But what we're talking about is where you choose to designate a pedestrian crossing, particularly on your 3, 4, 5, 6 lane roadways, and where traffic volumes and or speeds are high, and pedestrians need to get across the road. You can see on the left side of this chart, we have the different options of 2-lane, 3-lane with raised median, 3-lane without a median, a 4-lane with a median, and 4-lane without a median. Across the top, you have different categories of average annual daily traffic, less than 9,000, 9 to 15,000, and greater than 15,000. And these are categories that agreed and were consistent with the 2005 study in terms of where are the breakpoints with pedestrian crash risk and where you need to have more substantial treatments to address those. So you can see also that the 3 speed limit categories. So in each of the matrix cells, we have anywhere, numbers from 1 through 9, where a 1 is a combination of high-vis crosswalks, parking restrictions, overhead nighttime lighting, and supplemental signing. So those are all incorporated into option 1. A 2 is a raised crosswalk. 3 is the advanced yield here or stop here for pedestrian. 4 is the in-street pedestrian crossing sign. 5 is curb extension. 6 is pedestrian refuge island. 7 is RFB. 8 is a road diet, actually reducing the number of lanes. And a 9 is a pedestrian hybrid beacon. I will say also that for each of these numbers, you may see some of them with kind of a dark circle around them, and that means for that different situation, you really need to strongly consider this treatment, whatever the number is. And we have a kind of a blank circle around some of the number 1s, and in these cells, that means, guys, where you have this situation, don't put in just a marked crosswalk alone, because that's where, if you do that, you could be actually making things worse for pedestrians. So Dan's kind of clicked on a combination of a 4 or more lane without a raised median, which is the bottom row, combined with the column that says greater than 15,000 vehicles a day, combined with 40, 45, 50 miles an hour speed limit. And that leads you to an overlap of this cell that has 6 numbers in it. 3 of the numbers, number 3, 6, and 9, the advanced warning, the pedestrian refuge island, and the pedestrian hybrid beacon are in dark circles, which is saying, you really need to strongly consider one or all these treatments. Number 1 circle says, don't just do a marked crosswalk alone here. And number 5 and 8, curb extension and a road diet, well, these are possibilities, but you really need to meet certain criteria, or there are options to consider.
I think it's a nice way, Charlie, to think through all the options and how they might fit together. Again, this is coming from that FHWA Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian guide, which we'll provide the link to again in just a second. But it's a useful table. It gets at, what are those highest risk conditions and what can you do to improve them? Not just take out the crosswalks or don't do the crosswalks on the high speed, but do all these things to make sure that it's safe when you have them. This is another table that you wanted to talk to as well, I think.
Right, and so once you've identified what are your treatment options for a designated crossing, it really helps to know, what particular at that crossing is going wrong. Are the speeds too high? Are there conflicts? Are the drivers not yielding? Is there insufficient separation? So you can look at this secondary chart and help guide you to sort of which of these, 5 or 6 treatment options may be more appropriate. And obviously, this guide is intended to only give you some options, and you really need to follow up with going out and observing the site, watching traffic and pedestrian interactions, looking at the geometrics, and trying to decide, why are pedestrians behaving this way, or why are motorists not yielding, and really making a decision on the cause of the conflict or what crashes you had, and then have that lead you to the right solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here again, the slide, I just sent the link out. Check the step guidance out. It is really a nice way to wrap up not only the countermeasures and strategies we shared earlier, but how they really all fit together, and a good way to think about sites. I didn't want to leave off without mentioning the role of behavioral campaigns as well. I mean, we're focusing a lot on design here, but there is a role for education. And I think sometimes we shy away from those simple sort of awareness raising kind of campaigns, but we can look at things that are more substantial even than, you can remind people of what the laws in the crosswalks are, but also getting at things like driver training and driver education. Such a huge opportunity to integrate what Mike talked about with the specific laws about and rules of the road, integrating that into driver training and then on the road practice for drivers, for new drivers, getting them into conditions where crosswalks may be uncontrolled and how they behave around pedestrians. I think that that's a really critical opportunity that we can take advantage of. Obviously, enforcement plays a role as well. Enforcing laws related to yielding is possible through these high visibility enforcement tactics and strategies that NHTSA has laid out and some guidance for us, and even monitoring some of those items that are particularly relevant for multiple thread crashes, like the motorist passing or not yielding when one other vehicle has. So some things to be thinking about. Maybe we can get into some more of the behavioral element of these in the discussion period. I wanted, as we shift toward the close of our strategies, it's also always really useful to see how these are put into practice by agencies around the country. And that's why we're so glad that George Branyan is here joining us from DDOT to really tell us, how does this look on the ground and what has the experience been in Washington, D.C. when trying to work on this problem. So George, I can see your slide now. Please go ahead whenever you're ready. We're excited for this.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here with such a great group of experts in both research and practice. So take a couple minutes to talk about sort of how we're looking at multi-threat ped crashes and countermeasures and problem ID in Washington, D.C. I guess consistent with what Libby was saying earlier is it doesn't seem to be showing up very much in the data. First off, there's no field on the police crash report for a multi-threat pedestrian crash. And then we tried to get around that just recently. We're in the midst of a research project by Morgan State University researchers from Baltimore, and they're looking at 3 years of ped crashes, about 3,000 crashes, and only 20 after reading through the narrative that the police wrote, could they determine that they were multi-threat type? And so, and when I looked at crash type and ped action crosstab with those, most of them do appear to be sort of the dart out from between parked cars. They're coded that way, and only a small, maybe 3 or 4 were even at an intersection in terms of the police report. So, which just, it seems to be a little bit off from my gut sense when I'm out on the streets and looking at all the different crashes that I learn about and the complaints that we get, which seem to point to a lot of a problem at the marked crosswalks at many locations. So there may be a lot of near misses that are never reported. So it's an interesting question, trying to locate this issue in the data. Overall, the potential is there for a significant number of ped crashes. In 2015, we had I broke down all the ped crashes from that year by ped action, and the third highest, well, after other, unfortunately, again, is in a crosswalk where there's no signal. Some of those are stop sign crashes, stop sign location crashes, but a lot of those are at an uncontrolled crosswalk. So that's over 100 in that year. So the potential is there for more, but we're still looking into that. And as for severity, which was brought up earlier, that's where the potential's there. Again, this is the red boxes show the crashes that are happening in a crosswalk where there's no signal, and about 103 of them in 2015, 1 fatality and 8 disabling. Now, I don't know if those 8 disabling or that one particular fatal that year was a multi-threat, but you can see that compared to, say, the first row, which is in the crosswalk with the signal, which is at a signalized intersection, 0 fatals and only 6 disabling out of a total of 171. So the probability of a more severe injury at a crosswalk with no signal, whether it's a multi-thread or not, is one that concerns us, and especially as a Vision Zero jurisdiction, we're trying to push down those fatal and severe injury crashes. When they do happen, they tend to be pretty dramatic. This is from 2015 when a nurse was crossing this crosswalk on Wisconsin Avenue, and one driver stopped and another driver went by and hit that Jaguar. The dark Jaguar is the car that struck the young man, and he died a couple days later, and there's now a hawk signal at that location. And again, it's unfortunately an example of a crosswalk. We have way too many of them where the potential for these types of crashes is very high. This is what was done afterward. We did put a PED hybrid beacon in there, and so this also shows an advanced stop line treatment that we do for PED hybrid beacons, which is not exactly the same kind of crash, but it potentially is. The thinking that we came up with is that when you have the flashing red phase, when the flashing red phase is activated at a PED hybrid beacon, drivers may move forward if it's safe to move forward, but sometimes pedestrians see the countdown and they see 7 or 8 seconds left, and they think, oh, I want to get to the other side of the street, and they may rush into the crosswalk. They may even run into the crosswalk, and I don't want someone in a vehicle in one of the 2 or 3 lanes to advance, begin to move forward without being able to see the crosswalk as fully as possible. So we have a spec of 20-foot advanced stop lines at PED hybrid beacons. In this location, we only have one of the 2 crosswalks marked. So the one crosswalk or the one stop line you can see with the one car is about 20 feet back. The other one is more like 60 feet. But when we typically have 2 crosswalks marked at a PED hybrid beacon, we have the 20-foot advance lines. Some would say it should be more. As you can see, if you look down the street, the next signalized intersection is literally about 200 feet away, 250 feet away. So we're squeezing a lot into fairly tight intersection spacing sometimes, and so that's why we decided to go minimum of 20. The federal highway guidance in the MUTCD is very clear that you never should use the marked crosswalks alone. This is basically Charlie Zagier's seminal study from 2005, which it got into the 2009 manual, and so we try to use that to set up our policy. This is, of course, the matrix that came out of Charlie's study, and we customized it for DC, where we did not differentiate by posted speed limit, because we really have nothing more than 35 miles per hour, and most of even the major arterials are posted at 25 to 30. So basically it's the same idea, though, that when you move to the right and down, you move towards more aggressive and substantial enhancements. So when we get over 15,000 ADT and over 6 lanes, or 4 lanes with no median, then we're going to the PED hybrid beacon. It's the middle ground where I think the RFB is quite useful when you don't quite have as much volume. We do have some RFBs on some roads around 17,000 ADT, and we've gotten some good results. We have some RFBs on roadways with 10 to 11,000 with less good results based on actual step-out surveys, so it's interesting. So our PED master plan came up, used the Zagier study criteria for compliant, possibly compliant, not compliant. We overlaid that onto our roadway network and the ADTs and number of lanes. And so every red line there is a place where you do not want to have a marked crosswalk alone. However, on that red network, I have an intern working on this right now, and her first cut is about 1,000 intersections with marked uncontrolled crosswalks on that red roadway network. So we have a lot of work to do. We have I think we just installed our 17th or 18th pedestrian hybrid beacon. So we're just beginning to whittle away at what is a pretty substantial problem of a lot of marked uncontrolled crosswalks on major arterials. I wanted to focus a bit on the advanced stop line. It's been mentioned as a good countermeasure in conjunction with other things or on its own. I think the idea of having it on its own is great because it's extremely inexpensive compared with even a RFB, which is not bad at maybe $30,000 to $40,000, or a PED hybrid beacon, which in district is upwards of $200,000. But we tested the advanced stop lines at a location where we did install a rapid flashing beacon in 2008, and on the northbound approach we put it 30 feet back. On the southbound, because of a driveway to a church, we put it at about 50 feet back. And then we also added, as you can see, some a solid lane line on the 30-foot setback side, and then because of the driveway entrance, we used skips on the southbound approach. And it's a little hard to see this picture of the intersection with the RFB installed, and the arrows pointing at that stop line about 30 feet back. And what we did a number of step-out surveys, and this protocol, by the way, is from Ron Van Houten, a well-known researcher from Michigan, who sent me his protocol and spreadsheet so we could be consistent with other work that he's done in St. Petersburg on the RFBs. But if you can see, so this is our baseline before the RFB was installed, with no other enhancements except a raised, a high-vis crosswalk and a PED pylon sign. And we got about, as you can see, overall compliance is about 26% of drivers stopping. But the key here is that we put up, we were trying to measure the distance that cars yielded from the crosswalk, and so we used flags stuck on in the ground just behind the curb, going back from the crosswalk each direction, one at 10 feet, 20, 30, 50, 70, and 100. And then we measured that each time cars stopped. We not only measured whether they stopped or not, but where they stopped. And so you can see that you have some pretty, almost 30% of drivers are stopping between 10 and 20 feet. Only 41% were yielding further than 30 feet. And then maybe even more critically is the issue in this protocol is the whole issue of a multiple threat is captured by this particular column, which is driver passed stopped vehicle or attempted to pass a stopped vehicle. So in one set of crossings, we had 11 vehicles attempt to pass a vehicle that had stopped for the pedestrian. So this is important data to capture, because when we went back, and this is the 100-day follow-up, we did 7 days, 30 days, 100 days, 6 months, and then again a year, and our yielding rates were fairly consistent. So overall compliance rate at this location went up to 78%, but for our purposes, thinking about the multiple threat crash and the usefulness of advanced stop lines, we see that we ended up now with 74% of vehicles yielding 30 feet or further from the crosswalk. So this made a believer out of me on this relatively easy treatment. You see 1% stopped less than 10 feet, 5% less than 20 feet, 17% less than 30, and then you get this big numbers of people stopping much further away. And then maybe more critically, you see that the number of drivers who tried to pass a stopped vehicle or attempt to pass a stopped vehicle was at 2, which was really good. So this was really important research to show that this simple and easy countermeasure for a multi-lane approach to a marked crosswalk can work. Some other approaches that we look at in the district are a number of things, but a good thing to do is again, have some speed enforcement, because I think, as Mike Sonecki said, the likelihood of people to stop for pedestrians or be more cautious approaching a crosswalk is much less when they're going faster. So, whether you can get automated speed enforcement like we have in the district, or get your cops to do, good old-fashioned manual speed enforcement, try to get that, try to pull the speeds down. Lighting has been brought up, refuge islands, curb extensions, and then this easy on its own. I think it's good to go with advanced stop lines, but once you move to something even more powerful is the more substantial countermeasures, which would be the multi-lane, 4 multi-lane approaches, such as PED hybrid beacons, RFBs, and combined with stop lines. And then I think, and this has been brought up a bit, is the best thing to do is to try to eliminate multi-lane crosswalks, multi-lane crossings. So road diets, reconfigurations. We have done a few and have more planned in the district where we're reducing the number of lanes. These are not easy projects. These are big projects, take a lot of analysis and a lot of work. But even if you can go from 6 to 4, it's not as good as going from 4 to 2. But if you can go from 6 to 4, there's an opportunity to just reduce the opportunity for the multi-threat crash. We've got some roadways that were changed in the late 50s and early 60s in the district that are essentially 3 lanes in each direction with a 4-foot median. And in some cases, to this day, we still have rush hour restricted parking in the rush direction, in the peak direction, and that's not a good situation. So then you've got 3 lanes in one direction, and in one case, Bladensburg Road, for those who know the district, it's got a whole lot of uncontrolled crosswalks that are marked because of the offset intersections. So it's one of those situations where I think we could really reduce the chance of a multi-threat ped crash in an uncontrolled crosswalk if we could just reduce it from 3 lanes to 2 lanes. All right, so that's finishes up my presentation.
Thanks so much, George. We're going to jump right into Q&A, and I'm actually going to keep things right where you are, because something you said at the end of your statement there got at one of the questions we had. So we heard a few things from some of the earlier panelists about, well, congestion and heavy volumes. Clearly, one of the risk factors here that we see in the STEP guide, we heard Mike talk about congestion, traffic, as being a major risk for the multiple threat crash and other crashes involving pedestrians. So are we considering a countermeasure possibly as being getting those ADTs down, maybe reducing the number of vehicles on some of these locations? That's a pretty, maybe in some parts, a radical idea, but I wonder what you and DC think about that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's certainly a really ideal way to deal with it. It's just, people will say there's congestion here, and we'll say, well, there's just too many cars here. That's the main problem. And we just did a massive highway project in the district where we built 3 new bridges over the Anacostia River, and now have a freeway connection from 295 coming down into the district on the east side of the Anacostia, going over, connecting to 395, 695. So you can go all the way through, down and through the district, and you used to have to get off and go through some more local streets or do some other strange things. And it was supposed to pull traffic off of some of the commuter routes that people were using, East Capitol Street, C Street, and actually it didn't. The volumes are kind of back up on those local streets, or not local streets, but those arterials that were being used. So it's a tough. I think it's a tough. It's an ideal way, I think, to deal with it. But the reality is that while vehicle miles traveled did level off for a while, it's come back up, and you're still working against that. But I think one of the things about Vision Zero is one of the really critical piece of Vision Zero is that one of the principles of it is that safety trumps capacity. If you have an option of creating a more dangerous street by adding lanes, or making a safer street for other road users, for vulnerable road users, but you might have more, longer travel times or more congestion, then you should go with more congestion because it's a safer street.
Right. Yeah. No, totally. I think that's very interesting, because if you look at Charlie's STEP guide, you've got more lanes is bad, you've got higher speeds are bad, and you've got more traffic are bad. And so if we can address each of those things, it seems like we could address the problem. So I appreciate that response. And Charlie, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and again, the Vision Zero idea is, the U.S. may not be quite ready for this, but some of the European countries have done things like really limiting, vehicle travel in downtown areas, like they do in London, or have very high parking, like they do in Seattle. So cities like Seattle are really trying to make it. They're trying to use kind of the carrot and the stick approach, where you give a carrot, like the horses, you give them a carrot to make them run, and a stick if they didn't cooperate. So some agencies in Europe use that approach, and they talk about encouraging more use of transit and walking and biking, and make it easy and convenient to do those things, travel by those modes. And the stick approach, or the disadvantage of using your car, is they make it really expensive to park your car if you choose to drive it, or you're going to have to face congestion. So to try to think about, are there ways to encourage more walking and biking or transit use, I think is one, possibility for reducing vehicle congestion.
Great. So a few questions came in related to the, we talked about some behavioral messages and things you can do for drivers. There's a question about what can we do for pedestrians to at least inform them that this is a crash risk they may not be aware of, and to be aware of it. I mean, obviously we can't put all the onus on the pedestrian to protect themselves. We can do that through roadway design and other measures, but what are some examples, I guess, Mike and maybe Charlie, if you have any on strategies where we've tried to provide this message to pedestrians to be aware of this problem?
So, Mike?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've always tried to do is tell people to try to make eye contact with the driver, and not just the front of the vehicle. Many times they'll just look at the vehicle and not look at the driver. And if the driver's got something up to their head, or it doesn't appear to be looking at them, then they're probably not going to stop for them. So that's one of the things to do. And then also getting the message out is that the vehicle that has stopped is the blocker, and you cross one lane at a time as opposed to crossing the entire street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is Libby. I would encourage all of you to take a look at the latest versions of countermeasures that work, put out by NHTSA for pedestrian behavioral countermeasures. One of the challenges is just, getting messages out there. It's a really challenging way to change behavior. But lifelong training that involves adult caregivers and modeling good behaviors and such with pedestrians, young pedestrians as they walk. Our children are the most amenable to learning new and safer behaviors. I guess that is until they reach the teen years. But at any rate, I encourage you to look at countermeasures that work for more in-depth information about behavioral change. And it's a challenging approach, and human beings find remarkable ways to undermine their own safety sometimes.
Yeah, and we think probably pedestrian and driver distraction with smartphones is probably a factor that's effective. One thing that was tried in Miami-Dade County in Florida as part of this project we did for NHTSA, Miami-Dade Pedestrian Safety Demo, is they actually had different educational messages developed on these posters in English, Haitian Creole, and Spanish that they would put on the inside of buses. A lot of pedestrians take transit that were exposed to these safety messages over many, many months. And we did see a reduction in pedestrian crashes among that, adult age group. We don't know all the reasons, but anyway, it's at least something they tried to convey those messages, by way of, bus posters, radio and TV, et cetera, as another mode.
Good points. One final question, an interesting one came in on what can we expect? We can see a lot of promise of safety benefit coming from autonomous vehicles, and these vehicles with these technologies to detect all sorts of manner of people coming in from the side of the road and oncoming traffic and avoiding crashes in that way. I don't know if any of you are experts on the autonomous vehicle front, but would you speculate that those vehicles may have the capabilities of detecting things that drivers can't? Anyone want to jump into that one? I didn't warn you in advance we'd be talking about autonomous vehicles.
Not really.
Well, I want to say a few words that we had an autonomous vehicle that didn't recognize a pedestrian crossing, where they weren't supposed to be crossing, holding a bike. So there's still more work to be done in that area, and we don't know why. In this case, they had a driver that was supposed to be monitoring the vehicle and act as a backup, but they found out that the person was actually watching a television show when they were supposed to be monitoring it. So that's very, there's still more work that has to be done, but I see that as eventually when the bugs get worked out, and maybe beyond my lifetime, that is one of the greatest improvements that we can get to overcome driver error. If we can get the technology to work properly. But there's a lot that still has to be done, a lot of testing, and a lot of ways to get the bugs out of the system. In that particular case, they also had removed the emergency brakes because they said it was an uncomfortable stop conditions. So there were a few things.
Thanks very much, Mike. I think that you're right, and I think that if anyone that came across the white paper that PBIC put out last year, autonomous vehicles, bicycling, and walking, one of the big problems that we outlined in that paper was just that one you've illustrated, is this, not being totally sure that we're ready. The detection is capable of detecting all these scenarios and stopping in time. So I caution that that's going to solve our problem. We need to be looking to solutions like the ones that our panelists have laid out for us. I just took a moment to correct George Brannion's email on our slide. If you tried to use the last one that was listed, you would have reached Charlie Zagier. So thanks for someone pointing that out. All of our panelists' contact information is on the slide here. If we didn't get to your question today, I do hope that you'll reach out to us or to them to ask those questions. We want to continue that conversation even beyond the webinar. One thing I'd like to ask everyone to do just before we close out is consider checking out these animations. Those are really valuable tools. We hope that you'll consider reviewing the animations and the others posted on the website. Share them with others in your community, educators, members of the public, and staff that are working on roadway design. We hope they're really useful to you, and we hope that you'll consider attending the next 2 episodes when we plan them, hopefully in the next couple of months. I want to say just quickly, you'll receive an email later today that'll have a link to our archive page, instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance, and a few other pieces of information. I'll also let you know that as you leave today, a very brief survey will greet you. If you don't mind, please take a few minutes to share your thoughts, share your ideas about maybe sessions we could plan in the future. I just want to say once as closing, thank you again to all of our panelists for their presentations, and thanks to you all for attending our webinar today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll see you next time. Thank you.